Can equity be fluid? Ki, I agree to like 50-50, but maybe not later. You see, that doesn't work, right?
And it's typically something that you would sign and you'll forget about. You'll sign, you'll forget about it, and you'll only revisit it when perhaps something
So when you're
ambiguity.
getting divorced, then you go back to the prenup,
Yeah,
basically.
you go back to see, okay, what the hell did I sign up for?
Give me an example of a 50-50 going down, ending up being a terrible idea.
It's shaky ground already. If you don't define, that's typically where you need those founders agreement.
If you're not going to do 50-50 and you say, okay, you need someone who's clearly in the driver's seat. So what is that split? Is it 51-49 or is
Yeah.
it like 60-40?
It can be a completely amicable divorce.
What are you dividing, really?
Even two of the biggest law firms in India, their dispute was settled through mediation. And most businesses kind of fail because founders don't see eye to eye. And you can't cheat on me while you're in this relationship and for a period of 3 years later, essentially. It's very helpful. It's a really helpful start to your relationship with your co-founder. So you can always go back and say, listen, I'm doing a lot more than I anticipated. Is the founders agreement a substitute for an employment agreement?
Hi, I'm Lakshmi Chaudhry. I'm the host of Splainer's new series called The Clueless Founder. Look, a new founder's life is kind of crazy making. You have to do everything: raise paisa, make paisa, find a nice team, find the right partners. It's so insane. What we're going to do is every episode, we're going to take a deep breath and break it down bit by bit by bit. And to help us do it is one of my favorite people, Chitra Raghavan. She's a superstar legal eagle. She is the head of M&A at Rajaram Legal, and she co-led the M&A team at Reliance. And most importantly, she was the founder partner of Vigna Law, where she advised some of the biggest unicorns in the business, including Swiggy, Dunzo, and Daily Hunt. And she's going to help us figure out the one document that creates the most drama, but also helps you avoid the most drama: the shaadi prenup of the startup world, which is the founders' agreement. Ajay, let's just start with the obvious now. Like, what is a founders' agreement? It sounds very impressive, but what is it?
So it's essentially like a shaadi ka prenup.
Huh.
It's what founders kind of put together when they start off their new idea. It's an agreement that you'll have which kind of puts together certain aspects of the functioning. And this is before your investors and all of that. You say, you've just come up with this idea, let's say Splainer, and somebody joins, you have a co-founder and two of you have certain ideas of what you both are going to do. You put together this agreement which kind of sets out your ownership structure, perhaps your roles and responsibilities, and certain other aspects which will come through the podcast. But essentially, it's some sort of framework that kind of guides you as founders in your operations until perhaps you get an investor on board. And if you don't get an investor on board, it's something that just stays. So imagine you're getting in, you're getting married. Essentially, you're marrying. It's like a business marriage.
Okay, that sounds a bit scary, but fine.
It's like a business marriage. It's like a work spouse.
Okay.
Just think of it like a work spouse. And you're just saying, listen, this is how we're going to fix issues that arise. And it's something that you have to fall back on as some guiding note if you have issues that come up later on. And it's typically something that you would sign and you'll forget about. You'll sign, you'll forget about it, and you'll only revisit it when perhaps there's some ambiguity.
So when you're getting divorced, then you go back to the prenup.
Yeah,
basically.
you go back to see, okay, what the hell did I sign up for? And that is what happens with the
Okay.
founders agreement.
Acha, first thing I want to clarify is like you're saying, so if I'm sitting in my dorm room and I'm coming up with a cool idea with my roommate or whatever, bestie, do I need a founders agreement then, or I actually need a proper company, something, whether it's private limited or it's whatever, limited partnership? Does it happen after or before?
It can happen anytime during the life cycle, except when you have investors on board. Because once you have investors on board, you have your own set of agreements with them, like a different investment, shareholders agreement, all that stuff that comes in later on. This is just a note let's say you've set up something, you've set up a private limited or it's a partnership, whichever. It's something you can do at any point of the life cycle. It's better to do it when you start off, as opposed to being married for like 2 years to your work spouse and then suddenly saying, okay, now we need a prenup. Makes no sense, right? So you'd rather do it before, when you like, just before you get into that marriage, or even immediately thereafter. You can just
But it
kind of sit
sounds so
together.
vague.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like something. Okay, so then this is like, okay, this is like I could go on the internet and just get some template founders agreement, maybe tweak it a little the way me and my buddy figure out, and then sign it. That's it.
Yeah. So I mean, look, that's an option today you have with your chat gpt, perplexity. These are options that you have. Even otherwise, there are some templates that are floating around. You can even go to other founders and ask them, what do you have? Are you willing to share it? Can I just put it together? It can just be any document which gives you a framework. It doesn't, you can just put it in general terms also. It's not like you really need a lawyer, etc. The reason you need a lawyer to perhaps draft it is because they already have an idea of what to kind of feed you, and what to kind of make you, the kind of stuff that you should be thinking about and what you should be putting into your agreement. There may be certain things that perhaps, like for example, roles and responsibilities is not something you will know. You may not
Yeah,
know what you
there's a
want,
good
right?
answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like sometimes it's the three of you saying, let's do it together. And then
Yeah.
you kind of, you figure you'd, sort of feel your way
Yeah.
into who will do what. I mean, you have a general sense, but you may not know specifics. So then what?
Then look, that is one of the drawbacks of having this founders agreement, in the sense that you may be putting in or thinking too much before just going with the flow
No,
also.
and it's sealed in stone, na? Then it is a legal
You
document,
can
no?
always revisit it. You can always come back and say, listen, we'll do this for 6 months. We will come back and we'll figure it out and see if this is
So
what
you
is
can put
there.
an expiry date on
Yeah,
a.
you can. You can say that every 6 months we will review it, so that you know that the
And it's in
intention
the
was.
document.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's not necessary. You can keep your roles and responsibility fluid. Like
Hmm.
you can, it's not
Ah.
necessary that
Oh,
you have
that's
to,
nice.
yeah.
Huh.
So you don't have to say, Lakshmi will do only this, and Chitra will only do this,
Huh.
and the third founder will only do this.
Huh.
If you're very clear about that from the get go, then
Hmm.
it's something that you can add into the founders agreement.
Hmm.
But if it's not something that you're aware of,
Hmm.
and this is just something that you want to put together and say, okay, this is a larger framework, you can always say that, every few months or years we'll come
Hmm.
back, we'll revisit, not years but maybe months,
Hmm.
we'll come back, revisit these roles and responsibilities.
Hold on.
That's one way of doing it.
So when you say revisit, it's a very nice little diplomatic thing. Okay, let's say we say, okay, what is now? It's 2024. We say, okay, in 2 years from now, we will revisit this. But does that mean this expires 2 years from
No, it
now?
doesn't mean that. It means that your intention is that you want to look at this every periodically.
Does it make it less binding when you
um
say revisit?
it's not less binding, it's just setting your intentions. I think we'll come to the enforceability of founders agreements and all later. It's not meant to be something that is set in stone. It's supposed to give you some framework to work. So if you're going to put things into a founders agreement which is set in stone, then you are kind of shooting yourself in the foot, basically, because
Oh.
you're it's not meant to be absolute. It's
Hmm.
meant to be fluid. So you can draft your roles and responsibilities in very, very broad
Hmm.
terms, so that you have the ability to play around with it. But you're by and large saying that each of us is responsible for some aspect of the functioning. So somebody's in charge of finance, somebody's in charge of the operations, somebody's in charge of the just being the CEO and overall management of the company. You can have a lawyer on board and say you will look after legal stuff.
Hmm.
But I'm just saying these are things that you can generally put together, and
Hmm.
you can say that each person who's kind of in charge of this function can has some sort of a casting vote and say their final word is what matters.
Hmm.
Or you can give the CEO the casting vote and say, listen,
Hmm.
what the CEO ultimately decides is what flies, because you have sight over the whole business. as a whole. So, I mean, there are various ways of structuring those responsibilities, but you can totally avoid having responsibilities at all. So, it's not something that you need to have.
No,
It's,
okay. We'll come back to the responsibilities thing, huh? Like, we can keep talking. Actually, I have a very real life thing for that. The first thing that I found, remember, like I came into your office and I was doing my startup. I had a co-founder, and the first thing and the most ickiest thing is equity, right? And typically, when you start out, everyone wants everything to be equal, right? And maybe you even agree to it, right? And there have been endless number of cases, like the CEO of Zipcar, like yesterday or day before. I was like watching her, and she talked about the fact that, she found a co-founder she really liked, so she said, oh, fantastic, 50-50. And then turned out this person was not so great, or they didn't do enough work to even kind of merit 50-50. So let's take it bit by bit. I want to break it down. First of all, you have to agree. You're saying, oh, it can be fluid. Can equity be fluid? Ki, I agree to like 50-50, but maybe not later. But see, that doesn't work, right?
no. So, you have structures of
Hmm.
putting down, your equity also. You can say that, let's say it's your idea primarily. You
Hmm.
can say, listen, I'm willing to give you 50 or 40% of the company,
Hmm.
but it will vest in a certain way.
Hmm.
So you can say that even though I'm giving you 50% shares up front,
Hmm.
you're actually entitled to, maybe you'll have a 1 year cliff and say, after the first year, this 50% starts vesting in you. So it depends on how they're performing, how they're doing, etc. That we will look at each of our
Hmm.
individual kind of roles. But typically, one person takes the call in any of these scenarios. It's very, the minute you do 50-50, it's already, a little shaky, because and if you do 50-50 and you're not clear about what each of you are doing, then it is a little shaky. But you can say that it is
So
my
give me an
idea.
example. Give me an example, like why, like don't name names, but give me an example of a 50-50 going down, ending up being a terrible idea. Because I've heard that too.
Yeah.
I've heard like 50-50 is in general not a good idea because there should always be one person driving and
Yeah.
very clear.
Well, I can give you my examples also. I
Hmm.
mean, like,
Hmm.
even like
Hmm.
50, it keeps changing over a period of time. It may work for the first couple of years, and there's no example as such. I see,
Hmm.
even in larger transactions, when you have 50-50 joint ventures,
Hmm.
right? Even there, the question is always going to be about deadlock. Who gets the say when there's a
Hmm.
deadlock?
Hmm.
You want to avoid those situations from day one,
Hmm.
unless you're like absolutely, you absolutely trust the person, the person, you know that there is that even if you have your
Hmm.
fights, like my co-founder
Hmm.
in my earlier role was somebody who we had absolute trust, and we
Hmm.
knew that we could overcome any of those
Hmm.
issues. So it was never a problem for any of us.
Hmm.
In a situation where there are three people, and then there is an equal split,
Hmm.
then again there's at least one person who can split that deadlock, because then you have to take,
Hmm.
each of you has 33%.
Hmm.
It's not likely that two of you are going to be fighting and one person will not take a side. That will happen.
Hmm.
So you will have somebody who's going to be able to break
Yeah.
that deadlock.
Right.
But in a 50-50 situation up front, it's shaky ground already. If you don't define, that's typically where you need those founders agreement. Because let's say you do have that deadlock and say, boss, you're not pulling up your socks. You were supposed to do these things, you're not
Hmm.
doing these
Hmm.
things,
Hmm.
and you have that, then
Hmm.
immediately you have fallback options of your, of course you could have this vesting schedule
Hmm.
saying that you don't get this upfront, you get this on a yearly basis.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it takes one person to, Lakshmi has to say, listen, I need to take this call,
Hmm.
and I will be responsible for this, and you just have to go
Yeah.
by
So
what I'm
because
saying.
someone has to decide you're
Somebody
not
has to decide.
performing, right?
Now, let's say you don't want to do that in the beginning and say, okay, fine, we'll figure it out later on. At
Hmm.
least have some sort of, you can name a mediator. Maybe you both trust somebody
Hmm.
and you
Hmm.
know
Hmm.
somebody who will mediate your dispute.
Hmm.
You'll get somebody involved and say, okay, listen, we've got this issue. It's like
Hmm.
going for counseling,
Hmm.
right? You can even put in, I've seen situations where they even put like business counseling between founders
All
in
right.
their founders agreement to say, listen,
Hmm.
if this happens,
Hmm.
then you got to go and figure out a more resolvable way than to just go and say, I'll hold you to this clause and I will enforce it, and that's not the intent of that founders agreement. So to go back to your question on what happens with this 50-50 split, there are ways to structure that equity and the change in equity. Again, similarly, it's obviously difficult to take away something that you've already given. So you'd rather find a mechanism of resolving that dispute and saying, okay, if this happens and we both are just not able to agree and we've done this for like maybe 6 months and there's no resolution, then we go for, we go and get
Counseling.
some counseling. You go for business counseling, and then you
Right.
get somebody to come and work your work spouse issues out and figure that out.
But okay, so when you say like someone, like if you're not going to do 50-50 and you say, okay, you need someone who's clearly in the driver's seat. So what is that split? Is it 51-49 or is
Yeah.
it like 60-40 or?
Typically 51-49.
Okay.
But so it depends. Like there's a recent situation where somebody is doing an AI startup, right? And the whole idea is one person's, but they know they can't do it without the tech person on board, right? So then you kind of have some idea of the kind of responsibilities that each of you have, and the tech person's the technology partner is only required to develop the platform. So you just you kind of give him the you say, listen, I'll just give you 15% now. And there have been situations where this has been restructured as well. But that restructuring also depends on how you are working, where at what point you're coming in at, where how this what is the equation between the founders. If it's a good equation, then you will always have you know easier restructuring methods. So you can always go back and say, listen, I'm doing a lot more than I anticipated, so this is something that we should kind of restructure. And then again, you can do that as well. It's not like a founders agreement is one that uh, lasts forever. It's typically meant to last for as long as you are co-founders and you don't have a third party investor. That's the life of a
Yeah, but you
founders
make it
agreement.
sound very like, oh, this is a world where everyone is very sweet and emotional, rational. Your founders agreement says something that, hey, you give me 15% equity, now you give me 30%. Clearly, I'm working harder. Most times it's like that's not a pleasant. It's not going to go well in lots of cases,
It's
right?
not going to go lots of
Yeah.
cases, but that's where you need to fall back on. I think everybody views this founders agreement as something that you can go to court and say, hey, listen, I'm going to hold you to this. That's not the intention of the founders agreement. It is, like I said, it's supposed to give you a framework. It's something that you go and revisit when shit hits the
Okay,
roof.
let me switch that up for you. Typically, it's not easy to reach a founders agreement. Actually, it's very difficult at that initial stage because everything gets tricky.
Yeah.
Everything gets difficult. It's not that people avoid it because it's like, oh, I'm just too lazy.
Yeah.
It's because it is actually tricky business. All these things that you're so calmly saying, roles and this and that, it actually doesn't work that way. For example, it's not about your dividing your roles. Let's say you say, oh, one person, for example, I'm in a
You
new
could totally
startup,
avoid the roles,
right?
totally.
In fact, it's worse when you
Yeah.
avoid the roles, right? You say, okay, I'm going to do the editorial stuff, you do the marketing stuff, or whatever it is, you do the business end. But the thing is, the actual fight is about how will you take the bigger decisions. Who takes the bigger decisions about the business? Are we going to, like, if we go in a particular direction, or if we decide to raise money, all of that, right? Those are the things that you fight about. You fight about your roadmap, you fight about like what the product should look like. And just because the person has decided like they're going to do the marketing and business, they will have they will have full ideas about what the editorial should be, ki kya kar rahe ho, what is the product, what is this, even though they have no knowledge,
Yeah.
right? Because they feel like if they're doing the business side, it's not so clear to them that they should not have a say on what the product is itself,
But that's the
right?
point of the founders agreement, right? I mean, at
Hmm.
least if you had some framework of how
Hmm.
you are going to work,
Hmm.
it's forcing you to think of that in the first
Hmm.
instance, right? You're forced, and I think you're looking at the founders agreement in a very like uh, it's only there to define my roles and responsibilities. Actually, there
Hmm.
are other contours or like other things that go into a founders agreement.
Hmm.
Like, for example, what happens if one of you wants to leave? What happens,
Hmm.
what happens to the shares in that point of time? how do you resolve your disputes? Like, what is the dispute? It's not just arbitration and going to a court and saying, boss, I'm going to get, X amount of money, or I'm going to, get some injunction against you and all of that. It's also about saying, fidelity clauses. Like, you are going to be true to the company and not go and moonlight and do something else on the side. You're also not going to set up something competing with this. You're not, even if you leave, you're not going to do something that is competing with my business. You're not going to, poach my employees. There are a whole bunch of things that go into this founders agreement to give you some sort of understanding of what these two founders kind of have aligned with. Now, just on roles and responsibilities, at some point of time, you're just going to have to figure it out. You may as well do it upfront, right? And at least have. So let's say you didn't have the founders agreement. And you just had some conversation saying that you will be in charge of marketing, right? And these aspects of marketing. I have this experience. I will be the CEO. There is going to be, and maybe the third person says, I'm going to be, doing business, and you don't have any technology involved at this point. So these are like hazy kind of situations, right? Business, finance, marketing. They're all like hazy, like boundaries
Exactly.
are not there. At least if you had some founders agreement, even if you don't have a founders agreement, even if you had an email which said, listen, we're generally responsible for these things, even that is very good. So you can even have some indication of what each of you is responsible for, right? So you have a fallback. You say, okay, fine. You say, listen, you were supposed to do this. You're in charge of business, and you're supposed to build a business. Where is the marketing? What is the plan? And then the co-founder turns around and says, I don't know what you're talking about. I was supposed to only do finance, right? What is this business and marketing? And what do you mean by fundraise? I'm not in charge of fundraise. And you go back to the founders agreement. And it could go one way, either way, right? It could either be a situation where you've actually anticipated this and you have actually put it in the founders agreement to say, hey, listen, you are in charge of this and I'm in charge of fundraise, etc., etc. Or it could be hazy. And if it's hazy, then you know that both of you need to figure it out. Otherwise, both of you are screwed, right? So you need to figure it out. And most businesses kind of fail because founders don't see eye to eye, right? At that point of time, it's once the investor comes in, it's a different ball game altogether in terms of how the founder is dealt with. And it's not an employment agreement. It's a.
So what is the difference between the founders? So when you say in a founders agreement you don't have roles and responsibilities, is that solved by an employment contract? Because one of the things that I remember took me by surprise is that I didn't realize I was a CEO. I'd done a founders agreement where it was agreed that I'd be the CEO. So I never bothered to do an employment contract with, my company. And the same went for the other person.
Yeah.
Neither of us had employment contracts. So what is that difference? Like, why is it a problem? The founders agreement doesn't solve the problem of an employment contract, right? You still need one. No?
You still need one, but that is one of those agreements that generally founders don't sign because it's the last thing on your mind to have because you don't see yourself as an employee at that time. It's a mindset thing also. I'm not going to sign. I set up my own
But
business.
when
Sign.
I got into Texas, they said, where's your employment agreement? Where's your employment contract?
It's not there. You should have one, but it's not something that anybody. It's not. It's not something that anybody thinks of upfront.
Right.
Is the founders agreement a substitute for an employment agreement? No, it's not.
Okay. So tell me, what does the employment contract do that why did Techstars want an employment contract on top of the founders agreement?
So that when investors come in, they want it to be very clear that you are an employee of the company. And then, there are other things that come into an employment agreement, right? Like, for example, this whole non-moonlighting thing also is there. You're acting in the best interest of the company. You're devoting all your time and energy to the company. All the IP that you develop belongs to the company. They don't want any ambiguity there, right? So your founders agreement can solve for that also. You can also put in that the founders agree that whatever you develop, IP, like content, whatever you develop is owned by the company. You can put it in there. But an employee relationship is different from two co-founders. You're just two business owners who are agreeing to certain things in a founders agreement. Whereas once you set up your entity, and you can actually do this even if you don't have an entity. So you can even do this if you have, you're just operating as two individuals and you say, listen, these are the general contours within which we will kind of operate, but we'll set it up, when we set up the
Hmm.
company or the legal entity, this will kind of govern our structure even in that situation.
But the
You don't need
employment
it.
contract is a lot more kind of binding. It'll be specific. It'll be.
Both are binding.
I know, but you were just like you can revisit and all. I don't think you
Yeah.
get to revisit your employment
You
contract.
don't
Do
know.
you?
You revisit, not employment contract. You revisit your roles and responsibilities. That is
Hmm.
something that you can
No, but why?
always do.
Imagine I've signed an employment contract
Huh,
now, right? Okay, this all these things have happened.
huh.
Founders agreement, which is as he says, so sweet. Like we can always go back and we said, okay, in 2 years we'll do it, right? And then let's say 6 months down the line, we say, oh, we got a bit of money, and they said, तुम्हारा employment contract कहाँ
Hmm.
है? So then you sign the employment contract, right? And say, I'm the one who agreed to do the business side. And I
Yeah.
signed the employment contract saying I will be the CBO, jo bhi kya hai, right? Now, let's say we did it a little too early. And I'm not a very good CBO, or like I am not I'm not able to fulfill my commitments or whatever it is, right? But I've with the founders thing that you're saying you can just go back and revisit it and then sort of sort it out and maybe readjust the rules. What happens with the employment contract? Like we just sort of junk it and sign a new
No,
one
you
for a
can't
new
you
role.
can't change your roles if you signed an employment agreement.
Ah,
That's
so
a
that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Hmm.
That's not the intent. But you can once, and that's why I say you won't sign the employment agreement until somebody asks you to,
Hmm.
which is typically your investors. It's
Hmm.
very rare that you'll find founders who start and get all of this going, right? So that's why your founders agreement is your at the very least have some framework,
Hmm.
and then you can figure that out later in your employment contract. Your
Hmm.
employment contract will align with your founders agreement,
Hmm.
and then it's like then once you have an employment agreement, then it's you can't just, like you said, you can't just revisit roles.
Hmm. Hmm.
But
Hmm.
typically for like senior management and employment agreements, these roles and responsibilities are not like broad, they're very broadly defined,
Hmm.
and it's always subject to the board's discretion in terms of
Hmm.
your roles and
Hmm.
responsibilities. So that's how you bring in the flexibility of defining those roles and
So tell
responsibilities.
me what would happen if I was not really, figured out I didn't have a great talent as a CBO or whatever. The board would come in at that point, is it?
Yeah, and you guys are the board, your founders,
Ah,
you are the board. Unless you have
right.
investors,
Hmm.
so you have a lot of flexibility to redefine those roles. It's not like
Hmm.
you don't.
Hmm.
And if you're I think a lot of our conversation now has centered around roles and responsibilities, founders agreement. That's not the only intent, right?
Hmm.
So you can, like I said, you can always remove, you don't even have to have roles and responsibilities. You can say that roles and responsibilities are going to be discussed and kind of
Okay.
settled between the founders at a
Hmm.
periodically
So
every
what
3
what does it
months.
have to include? Equity to tumne kaha.
100%, you have to know
Ah.
upfront
Okay. Then
what you're
what does it
dealing with.
have to? What do the others have
Equity,
to?
you can say, these are, you can have a
Hmm.
vesting schedule where one founder is calling the shots. You can
Hmm.
say, even if you're
हाँ
entitled
ठीक है. We covered
50%, you
that. What
have all
else
of
is
that.
there?
IP ownership,
हाँ
non-compete,
ठीक है.
non-solicit, right? To say, listen, even if you're with the company and when you leave, maybe for a certain period, maybe.
And someone will decide what a non-compete is, I suppose.
No, non-compete is essentially fidelity
I'm
clauses, right? To say no cheating. You cannot cheat on me.
like
If you're
what is
cheating on,
not, but
and you can't cheat on me while you're in this relationship and for a period of 3 years later, essentially.
see, these things are all like around tech, man. Like,
Yeah.
what is non-compete in retail? What is non-compete in
Yeah.
news? There's no such thing. That means you're saying I won't ever do news ever. Like everything is a compete then,
Yeah, but then that's just it's just there, right?
right?
In the horizon. I mean, everyone who has non-compete clauses know that it can swing either way. It
Hmm.
could it's largely looked as unenforceable at an
Oh,
employee
really?
level. Yeah.
Huh.
So I mean, it's not something that is absolute and set in stone in terms of enforceability.
Hmm.
So you can always, it's very difficult to prove that somebody is competing with. How will you know, right? Unless you have some concrete evidence that somebody's actually stolen your information, is stealing your people,
Hmm.
and has replicated this.
Hmm.
Because I can do anything through benami, right? I mean, through somebody who's not related. It doesn't necessarily have to be me. I can find a friend who I'm really close to who can set up that competing business. So it's not about whether it's not about whether it's enforceable or not. It is about the intention that you are not supposed to be doing this. Tomorrow I have some ground to go and say, hey, listen, you are not supposed to be doing this. We agreed you won't do this. Right? You agreed you
You're
won't
being a
cheat.
bad person.
Yeah. But it's not so easy to say bad person in business. It's difficult to say that. So there's always so it's like you're not cheating.
I mean, like, dog is like, stop it. Stop it. Don't do it.
Yeah, exactly that.
Look, there is like founders agreement. You
But
said
it's not like anybody. It's not like you've seen founders who have gone and enforced it or anything like that. But
no.
I've seen founders who have benefited from it, and they
Give
have
me an
benefit.
example.
Yeah. So, for example, maybe 5-6 years down the line,
Hmm.
one of the founders just. I mean, the business changes, you change as people, your priorities change as a person, right? Your priorities change as a founder as well, and you just don't align. And so it is like it can be a completely amicable divorce, right? So it can be something that each of you kind of walks away with. And I've seen situations where that is that was possible because there were these exit clauses which clearly said if one founder wants to quit and go, they can do so after so many years. So they have to commit to a certain amount of time with the company. And if that happens, then this is the manner in which you will this is the way in which you'll arrive at, what your shares are valued at, etc. And then one founder buys the other founder out, or they find somebody else to buy them out. So there are various ways of dealing with this, but this has been possible only because of founders agreement.
We had a
But I'll
founders
also
agreement, and then the other person says, "I don't want to be bought out. I'm going to exit the company and hold on to my stake." Then what?
then it's a impasse, right? So you're just stuck with something that you have to resolve. Finally, how did you resolve that?
I just, gee,
You just forgot about it and just moved on, right?
I had to do all the dirty work
Yeah.
of shutting the
Yeah.
company down. But
Yeah.
it killed the company, no?
Yeah, it
I mean,
does.
because it becomes a stalemate.
Yeah.
You can't have someone who holds such a big chunk of your company but is not playing the role that they got that stake for. And we made the mistake of, and you keep saying vesting is very sort of considered rude. You're trying to like doubt the other person's integrity. They don't want to vest, they want it outright. And then they're like, why am I vesting if you're not vesting? Then it goes down that, ghastly path of, and that's why people don't do it, right? I mean, that's the other thing I wanted to ask was, typically when you start with someone, you are in the honeymoon period, right? I mean, it's the same thing. Like, no one wants to think about a prenup. You're saying prenup. At least prenup, bhai. Tomorrow, if I, married a multimillionaire, at least he can see the money he has to protect from me, right? I mean, he knows like why he should be doing this prenup,
Yeah, fair enough.
right? But when it's the two of you and you have absolutely anda, you barely have a bank account for this damn idea that you have. It's very hard for you to see like what
Yeah.
are you dividing really. You don't even have a product for you to say IP, and a lot of things don't even have IP, right?
Yeah.
Like if I say let's do a cookie shop, I mean cookie shop mein kya IP hai, right?
Your recipe.
Arey bhai, we're typically only doing like it won't be any great recipe.
No, but that's the thing. So it's not going to solve for a lot of things. Your founders agreement is not. It's like any other
So no,
agreement
I'm
that
saying, but
doesn't
when you're in the
found.
honeymoon
Yeah.
period, how do you?
That is when you should do it, and that is when, to answer your question, that is when two good lawyers can help you. Because then
so that's what I was trying to
yeah.
get
So I
to.
think you have your own, representation, and then lawyers kind of battle it out.
We had
with
only
you.
one. We had only you.
Yeah.
Ah.
So I mean, there was nothing concrete then. There was valuation also was up in the air. So the question is, what do I want to do? And the thing is, you realized that, or like another founder will realize that this is not worth it, right? If there isn't enough of that pie to kind of want
Fight
all of
over.
it and fight over, then you're just going to say, okay, let me just restart this in a different way. And that's pretty much what it's not meant to. It should have solved that dispute. And I'd forgotten that you had signed a founders agreement.
Yes.
But it should have It should have solved that dispute. But the only way in that sort of situation to solve for it is, I think we all learn from
Yes.
uh, past,
Yes.
experiences also. Maybe we could have done something more, included like a mediation thing,
Right.
forced you all to mediate a dispute and
Hmm.
things like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
Those are things that I would do in this day and age. But
Hmm.
it's a great kind of framework to have. And
Hmm.
even if you don't call it founders agreement, you call it whatever you want, key principles, governing
Hmm.
document,
Hmm.
whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
You put it together and you at least have some things that you all align on, right? You don't have to agree to everything.
Hmm.
Just even bare minimum stuff. And it is something that will come in handy at some
Uh,
point.
right. So that's
It
where I
gave
want
you
to
a
get to.
ground to say, listen, we've
Hmm.
agreed to this. I should be able to buy you out. It can't be a
We didn't
stalemate,
put that in
right?
the founders
Yeah.
agreement. We didn't put it in the founders that the other person has to sort of be bought out or be willing to be bought out.
So what
Rather.
did it say?
It didn't. It did. It basically said it was so like obsessed with everything else. I think
Yeah.
IP, equity, roles and responsibilities.
Responsibilities.
So we missed this completely, right? We just said if you leave the company, I mean, if you leave your role, you get to hold on to your equity. It was more
Right.
about safeguarding your right to your equity rather than the other
Other way.
way, right?
But that
So,
may have been a result of discussions at that point of time. It could have
yes.
been a situation where you did not foresee,
Hmm.
something like this happening, and therefore you may have wanted to be like, uh, you know, egalitarian,
Right. I mean, it's like it doesn't matter what
and then
happens,
say,
you
yeah,
figure it
and
out.
it doesn't matter. They should be able to keep their
Hmm,
equity,
hmm, hmm, hmm,
and it
hmm,
should be something that they want to offer
hmm,
up.
hmm,
Now the problem is that somebody ran away with that,
hmm,
and never. And the problem is that
hmm.
the company died because of that.
Right.
Maybe that was the
Hmm,
intention for the company to die. But the the it's not that it's going to solve for
hmm,
everything,
hmm.
but it is going to give you a framework. And it did. I remember it did give you some ground to like go and
Yes.
say certain things to your co-founder. And that happens everywhere. It happens
Hmm,
like it's something that you take. Let me look at some other examples that are there.
hmm,
Like for example, two friends. There was no
hmm,
here. This is a situation where there's nothing
hmm. No
written,
personal,
right?
there was
Right.
nothing.
So they're
Hmm,
two friends running a business,
hmm,
like best friends who are running a business,
hmm,
and just some personal issues that crop up
hmm,
in one's life,
hmm,
because of which they'd switch off,
hmm,
and it was a bad kind of
hmm,
breakup, I would
hmm.
say. The lawyers nearly derailed the whole process at that time, at the fight time.
So
So
hold on. Let me just understand. So it broke not because of the business, but their personal relationship broke.
no, the business also kind of almost
Huh.
broke, right?
Hmm,
Because it reached a stage where there was nothing in writing. It was
hmm,
all a you said, I said
hmm,
sort of thing.
hmm,
We never discussed what we would be,
hmm,
what we would be saying. We don't have any framework within which we're working.
hmm,
And then both parties got lawyers involved.
hmm.
Lawyers kind of one lawyer actually nearly derailed the whole process.
Ah.
There was nobody to mediate them. And the thing is, at least they should have come away with their some friendship intact, if nothing else. At
Hmm,
least it should have been something that was amicable. And
hmm.
that's like a messy divorce, right? Because
Right,
you
right,
are
right. Hmm.
essentially your work spouse and you are moving away.
Right.
So there was no understanding on what happens if if one founder just ups and leaves. There's
Ah.
no, if you're not involved, there's nothing to fall back on.
Hmm.
Can you start a competing business? Can I just set up the same thing in a different country?
Hmm.
None of that was there. Ultimately it boiled down to somebody they both trusted saying, okay, fine, this is how it's going to get resolved, and it got resolved. But it's
Hmm.
almost always one founder kind of buying the other founder out.
Hmm.
So if you have that upfront as a
Hmm.
principle and say, listen, this is an option, and we'll arrive at it in a fair manner and
Hmm.
specify the price, all of that in the agreement, then
Hmm.
you actually at least have some ground to say, listen, this is what we need to be doing.
Hmm.
Ultimately, no founder is going to go to court. No, you will not find those kind of disputes.
Hmm.
No founder is going to go to court because you already don't have money. What are you fighting over?
Hmm.
And you spend on
Hmm.
lawyers fees, and then
Hmm.
the whole court kacheri thing
Hmm.
that's happening.
Especially in India, it'll take
Yeah,
years, right?
it'll take
I mean,
forever.
that's what my lawyer told me. He said, you're never going to win this. He said,
Yeah,
all you're going to do is sit in court for like 10
yeah.
years. You might as well just take
And
it on your
nobody wants to
job.
do that, right?
Right.
So it's in your interest to have. Then that's where you have this whole mediation as a dispute resolution mechanism, which I've always, at least for founders, I've always advocated it and put it together. And it's a clause which says that you will mediate, and mediation is, there are formal ways of doing it now. You have, it's institutionalized. There are also some individuals who are expert mediators, like some are expert
Are
mediators in
they
business.
usually like kind of like corporate people, or is like what about emotional? Like, a lot of like,
Yeah,
actually what happens between two founders. That's why I asked you if it was personal. It's really not so much even about the issues at hand, right? Like your relationship just starts to
yeah,
fray and become toxic, and then
which
it
is a work
actually,
spouse.
yeah, I mean, and actually the intervention you need there is actually of a therapist.
Yeah,
You actually need like a marriage counselor or a divorce counselor that you have today.
and you need somebody who's doing a win-win situation. It's not like a win-lose,
Mm,
right? Because even though
mm.
you're out to get somebody and say you screwed me
So who is this
over.
person? Like, I mean, is that what the mediators do? Do they
Yeah, they do.
behave?
There
They
are there
do.
are mediators. You can even, it doesn't
They do the emotional
necessarily,
stuff. You're saying.
there's no emotional stuff. Nobody's looking to, that's just business counseling. So you find
So,
business
yeah. So you have
therapists.
to explain, man. I'm the
uh,
clueless founder, right?
no,
You
actually,
keep saying business counseling,
I've
business. I don't know
heard
what business
I've
counseling
heard of
is.
I've heard of people very
You
recently going for business counseling. I'm sure there are counselors
you are rumored.
who specialize in that, and I
Oh, for the
wish it was,
emotional stuff,
yeah, the emotional stuff.
right?
You're not going to find two men who are going to go for that. At least not in freaking India. So forget about that. But
Mm,
you're going to have this. It's a.
mm.
I'm sure it's a great money making thing also, to
Oh,
have
you're
like
trying to imply it's
business.
a scam now.
Yeah, business coaching. No, I'm not. I think I totally believe in
Huh.
therapy. So I
Mm,
think, I'm sure therapies exist for all kinds of relationships,
mm,
not just your
mm,
partner,
mm,
even your work spouse,
mm,
and you can sort things out. That's one part. But mediators, there are people who are actually qualified
mm,
mediators. There are institutions that actually handle mediation. We can
mm,
go into that some other time. But
mm,
essentially, there are, and they, even the largest disputes
mm,
are kind of resolved over like maybe 2-3 sittings of mediation.
mm, mm,
Even two of the biggest law firms in India,
mm,
which their dispute was settled through mediation. So it's
mm.
not like you just have to, if you,
It's the
it's just that,
spirit. You have the
yeah,
spirit of accepting mediation.
and wanting a win-win situation.
Mm, mm,
You don't want a situation where somebody loses.
mm,
Of course,
mm,
you're not in that frame of mind, but at least this founders agreement will bind you to it and
mm.
say you're
So
forced to
tell
do
me what
this.
kind of disputes, I mean, commonly do you see, or like usually what is it that like ends up being like this sort of a kind of dispute that you have everyday disputes, but the kind that triggers a crisis or really sort of puts things at risk. I mean, give me examples of the kinds of things that people really fight over. Like,
Yes,
with couples, it's money, it's cheating, you know.
I think
Uh,
it's vision is a big thing. Vision is a
uh,
huge issue,
huh,
in terms of what do they see the organization as, because this
mm,
is not what we signed up for. That's one of the things
ah,
that
mm,
is very, very usual in these kind of situations. It's not usually about the money, because face it, you are at this founder stage where there are no investors.
mm,
You pretty much don't have that money.
mm,
It's very rare. So it's not going to be so much about
mm,
money as it is about, this is not what I thought I had signed up for,
mm,
and this is not the direction in which I see myself going with this company. The
mm,
other thing is, it's a lot of hard work, right? Like being a
mm.
founder is just so much hard work, so
Right.
much.
It's extremely stressful.
It's very stressful. You constantly at loggerheads with your family.
Hmm.
You don't have time for yourself.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think it takes a physical, mental toll on you also. So founders have typically backed out for that as well. Just said, listen,
Hmm.
I don't want to do this. Sometimes they get really good job offers which you can't kind of,
No, they just want to
yeah,
leave.
you can't compete with that kind of money. So those are things that and they just want to leave, right?
Hmm.
Those are some of the things, so some of the issues that we've seen.
Does a big company poach one of the founders as an alternative to
Yeah, of
buying the
course.
company? Right.
Of
They're
course.
basically poaching the idea.
Of course. Of
Ah.
course.
Mm.
And that's
Well,
where you are.
that is really awful.
Yeah, and
That's
then you.
disastrous.
Yeah, and then if you join, if you had some understanding of, maybe you can't join a competing business and you have to put in X number of years, at least you have that understanding. That's at least a ground for which you can have some discussions with the founder. At least try and, you know, be assertive and say, listen, this is not something that I'm okay with, that you just
But they
join.
know you can't go
Yeah,
after. Forget them. You can't even go after the bigger company,
but you
right?
might.
Mm,
But you might. The company is not involved.
mm,
It's between two founders. And
mm,
typically what happens is companies don't want to, if they know that you have this they may not
mm,
know that you have this kind of a contract.
mm,
So either they will buy you out.
mm,
Sometimes if they know, they may buy you out, but most of the times it's like, listen, can you please figure this out and then come and join us, sort of
mm, mm,
situation. So
mm,
you don't want that nuisance factor in your life,
yes.
right? So
Mm,
these kind of understandings can be a nuisance factor, to say,
mm,
listen, hey, you said you're not going to join a competitor, how can you just go and join
mm.
this person, whether it's a large company or a
And
small
आजकल you can go
company?
on X or like whatever and
Yeah,
do some long thread
yeah,
on this
absolutely.
person.
So then you have some ground on
Uh,
which you can at least start having those discussions.
mm,
It doesn't have to be a situation where it boils down to a he said she said sort of thing, or you said
mm,
this and I said this and I never agreed to this and you never
mm,
agreed to this,
mm,
and
mm, mm,
you know there's something, some document to say, listen, we agreed to something. What do you
mm,
mean we didn't agree?
mm,
How can
mm,
you say
mm,
you didn't agree? that's
mm.
that's all
So
it
basically, it
serves.
prevents gaslighting.
It prevents, no, it doesn't. It's not gaslighting.
Well,
I
when the
think
other person says,
no,
it's like very typical, like,
yeah,
this is what my boyfriend does all the
yeah.
time with me. He's constantly gaslighting me. He's like, no, when did you say that?
But yeah, it prevents, maybe in a way it prevents gaslighting, but
Yeah.
it's not foolproof for sure.
Mhm.
But it's very helpful. It's a
Mm.
really helpful start to your
Hmm.
relationship with your co-founder. Just ironing this out, and it will be very helpful if you have two good lawyers
Hmm.
who kind of come. Maybe one lawyer can recommend the other lawyer, right? But nobody wants to pay lawyers at that point of time. So it's like, what is
Hmm.
this? And of course, you have that option. Like I said, you can always go and figure out a format online and kind of,
Hmm.
have your base.
Or
But
have
it
one
is,
lawyer like we did.
you can always have one lawyer,
Hmm.
absolutely,
Hmm.
who, and ultimately it has to be something that is fair.
Hmm.
And it does not mean that if it's fair that it's going to hurt somebody. It could
Hmm.
hurt both parties. Like
Hmm. Hmm.
in your case, perhaps it hurt both parties because it just
Hmm.
fell through. But maybe that was the natural course it was supposed to take.
Hmm.
Also, we
Hmm.
don't,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, for us, it was very
One
much
way or the
what you
other.
said, right? You don't agree. You actually realize that you don't agree on what the product is.
Yeah,
You don't even agree what the company is about, and but the problem is that you don't. It took me 6 months to realize that was the problem
yeah,
because in the thick of things, it became so personal
yeah,
and so angry and so toxic that you weren't able to step back and say, "This is not going to work for all these." Very good rational reasons, and it has nothing to do with the reasons that you're actually
yeah.
fighting. You know what I mean?
But do you think it would have helped if you had perhaps named someone in the agreement and said, "This is the person we will go to
You
if we
have,
have some."
I think enforced mediation
Yeah,
would have, but I also think like, and this is where I'm very skeptical about anything legal, especially in India. I don't think anyone has any fear
yeah,
because yes, typically what happens, at least in my experience, both of you are lawyers and then you send really nasty notices to
yeah,
the other person. It's very long, lots of legalese. You accuse the other person because your lawyer will accuse the other person of like, everything, and their lawyer will accuse you back. It's basically everyone's covering their
yeah,
ass, right? I mean, that's basically what's
yeah,
happening. And then at some point, exhaustion sort of sets
yeah,
in. Hopefully, it does. And it's the company ends,
yeah,
and typically there's, like you said, there's not much to fight over, so that's why it's better than a
yeah,
divorce. Typically, there are children and dogs and houses and things to actually fight over. Mercifully, most startups, fall
yeah. There are
apart,
no
so
assets.
yeah, fall apart fairly early,
Yeah.
right? So one person just, they both decide, one person does a disappearing act and the other person is like, what, let's just shut the company
This
down.
disappearing act is a very common theme, though.
Really?
It's a very common theme.
Yeah,
Like
because,
somebody just
yeah,
disappearing
just
because they.
stops responding and just sort of.
incommunicado, don't know where they are. It's
Hmm.
a pretty but they're all, like I said, they're all part of, these bigger issues of, you
Hmm.
don't see eye to eye on the vision, you're going through some issues, mental issues, or
Hmm.
you're not able to handle the work pressure,
Hmm.
because being a founder is not for everybody,
Hmm. No, I
right?
agree.
Absolutely. It's all very, oh wow, we'll set this up and gungo
Hmm.
and all of that.
Hmm.
When
Hmm.
it comes to, the shit of actually getting things done
Hmm.
and not taking home a salary, not taking home money, it's really tough, and it's not for everybody. So I think
Yeah.
this is something that, I mean, that's a different
Hmm.
issue altogether. I mean, not solved by a founder. Now this is not
No,
solved
no,
by
no.
any founders
Actually, let
agreement.
me say that. Like, I have done a startup where I've had co-founders, and
Right.
now Splainer, I'm the sole founder. And so I have a different perspective. It's like suddenly you're a sole founder, and you think it's going to be so much easier because there's no one to sign an agreement with. It's all
That is the
you.
issue, that it's
But
all
that's the
you.
problem. It's all you,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's nobody else,
There's nobody else.
right?
I think that's a lonely journey as
Yeah,
well.
that's very
Yeah,
lonely.
it is a
You
very
know.
lonely journey. But I mean, of course, you don't have those issues with documentation and
Yes,
all of that.
exactly.
So that's
Yeah.
that's a good thing. But for any founder that's, that is looking at the business
Hmm.
as something they want to scale with
Hmm.
co-founders, all of that, it's
Yes.
always advisable to have this.
Hmm.
It, like you said, the pitfalls are the fact that it is, if you get lawyers involved, it's costly,
Hmm.
right? Maybe you're building too much and thinking too much at the start when you should be fluid,
Hmm.
right? It's not for founders who anticipate, I mean, their idea is so good that they perhaps already have investors lined up and they know they're going to
Hmm.
raise some investment in maybe
Hmm.
6 months to a year. Then it's fine, you can just, do away with it completely. Some
Hmm.
people start with committed funds, so
Hmm.
you know that you're setting it up and you're going to have investors on board soon, and largely you know how you're operating, you don't need that founders agreement.
So hold on. So once
This
the
is
investors come on, then what happens? Then the founders' agreement doesn't matter.
Yeah, then it's
Hmm.
just superseded by your investment agreements. You can't have side agreements, operating between the founders and one set of agreements with the
Hmm.
investors. So investment agreement will have, rights and obligations of your founder and their roles and
Hmm.
responsibilities. Then you'll have to
Hmm.
sign the employment contract, and then that will have the roles and
Yeah, then that's the
responsibilities.
handcuffs,
Yeah,
right?
but you
Yeah.
have like, when investors come on board, etc., you will have an operational matrix, decision making matrix. All of this
Yeah.
is there, so you can actually preempt that by having it, agreeing to that upfront.
Some of that, yeah,
And
and without the investors in the room sort
yeah,
of bullying
and
you.
you can literally have a 3-page
Mm.
founders contract, so you don't
Yeah.
need to have.
Mm.
It's just that, I think the what I drafted for you was maybe 10 years ago.
Mm.
So even today, the way I would draft an agreement
Mm.
is, maybe just say,
Mm.
your roles and responsibilities are fluid, and that,
Mm.
but largely each one is responsible for one of these things.
Mm.
Please don't go work with any competitors for X number of
Hmm.
time.
Hmm. Hmm.
If literally you can have these 4 pointers,
Hmm.
right? If one of you is,
Hmm.
if you don't align on vision or
Hmm.
something like that, we'll figure out a way. But one founder should have,
Hmm.
the founder wants to stay back and run the business, should have the right to kind of buy you out,
Hmm.
and we'll figure out a fair price, and that fair price will have, you can appoint your own value or
Huh.
somebody
All
who's
those important things you didn't put
right. So yeah, so
in.
we can put in all those things, because at
Hmm.
your stage it was more about
Hmm.
tying you both down to say, listen,
Right.
these are the
Things we.
things that you need,
Yeah.
and these are, maybe we didn't see it as somebody
Mm.
exiting at that point of time. I mean, it's
Yeah,
that's
there's no
that's also
valuation. There's nothing, no, at that point.
no
There's no.
valuation. You just
Yeah.
need to say, your
Mm.
chartered accountant will tell you how
Mm.
much,
Mm.
to pay for
Mm.
these shares, and move on. At least you know who you're
Mm.
supposed to go to for this kind
Well,
of
this is
stuff.
this is actually a good time to stop because, like, in the next episode, I think that's what we should talk about because you think like the founders agreement is difficult. I mean, there's no one more difficult than your investors, right? I mean, the investor agreement is it's just like a minefield.
Yeah.
It's full of death traps. That's like that you're going to like really regret because you're so eager to for the money, so desperate for the
Yeah.
money, really, and they're willing to basically sign over your life. That's all for this episode. We'll also be answering your questions on the weighty subject, so be sure to leave them in the comments. I'll see you soon.